Have you ever noticed how often rituals get turned into gatekeeping tools? What starts as a shared moment of memory or meaning can slowly become a system of judgment where only the worthy are allowed in and the rest are left outside. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for the Feast of Corpus Christi, we'll explore the tension between belonging and exclusion, and between the symbolic power of ritual and the theological dogma that can drain that power of its underlying meaning. In this episode, we're asking an honest question. What happens when we stop defending supernatural claims and instead focus on the human values that these stories can teach? Because maybe what makes a ritual sacred isn't what we believe happens to the bread, but what we're willing to do for one another once the meal is over. So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for the Feast of Corpus Christi, the body and blood of Christ, Cycle C of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't demand a belief in the supernatural. What that means from a practical standpoint is that we will assume that these stories and writings are fiction, written by pre-scientific people who were trying to make sense of the universe. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, but I encourage you to look for something that rings true to you. Part of the beauty of understanding these writings as sacred myths is that we're free to interpret them for ourselves. We're free to learn the lessons that we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for the Feast of Corpus Christi, Cycle C. Our first reading is from Genesis, chapter 14, verses 18 through 20. Our second reading is from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. It's chapter 11, verses 23 through 26. And our gospel reading is from Luke. It's chapter 9, verses 11b through 17. Now we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings, then we'll look for the messages and the main lesson in each one. Finally, we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. And with that, let's begin. Our first reading is from Genesis. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. Our second reading is from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper he took the cup, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this, whenever you drink it, in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And our gospel reading is from Luke. Jesus welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed healing. Late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him and said, Send the crowd away so they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we are in a remote place here. He replied, You give them something to eat. They answered, We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for all this crowd. About 5,000 men were there. But he said to his disciples, Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each. The disciples did so, and everyone sat down. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. All right, so let's go back now and take a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from the book of Genesis. And in this tiny snippet about Melchizedek, we see one of the strangest little bits of Scripture to ever be elevated into theological importance. Right, we've got a king priest who shows up out of nowhere, brings out some bread and wine, blesses Abram, and poof, he's gone again. But the Catholic Church sees this as a foreshadowing of the Eucharist. Catholics hold this up as proof that communion has deep biblical roots in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, setting aside the bread and wine symbolism, there is something deeply human here that's worth exploring. Melchizedek's gesture seems generous and maybe even sacred when we only read this little snippet. But it looks a lot more nefarious when we zoom out and see the full picture. Within the wider context of this reading, we see that Melchizedek may have been playing politics. Abram and a few hundred of his retainers had just recovered people and belongings that had been stolen from the king of Sodom. So Melchizedek was basically trying to keep Abram on good terms. He was probably trying to curry favor with Abram or reinforce an alliance. Now, Abram's response comes in the verses immediately following the ones that we read. And he refuses to accept any sort of payment from the king of Sodom. He refuses so no one could say, I made Abram rich. And that gives us the real lesson here. Even when you win, even when you deserve a reward, it's wise to be cautious about the strings that come attached to things that seem like generosity. Because sometimes that gift is actually a transaction in disguise. And that's what makes this story such an odd choice for a religious ritual that's supposed to be about selflessness and grace. Look, the moment the church uses this story to justify the Eucharist, while simultaneously using that sacrament as a gatekeeping tool for who's worthy or unworthy, we actually see the real meaning behind it. When the church gives you the gift of the sacrament of the Eucharist, there are all sorts of strings attached. And that's unfortunate because gifts, at their best, are expressions of love and connection. But when they're used to demand loyalty or create spiritual debt, well, they stop being gifts altogether. So the main lesson I got from our first reading is that gifts aren't given to put someone in your debt. This little scene with Melchizedek is more cautionary than celebratory. It reminds us that when we give or receive, we need to ask, is this a gift or is it a trap? Real generosity doesn't come with conditions. It doesn't whisper, now you owe me. Whether it's bread, wine, or simply your time and presence, let's give freely and receive graciously, without hidden strings or spiritual IOUs, because gifts aren't given to put someone in your debt. Our second reading was from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. And at its core, this passage is about remembering. Paul's telling people to honor a moment where Jesus broke bread and said, "Do this in memory of me." It's a very human instinct, wanting to be remembered, wanting our values to live on after we're gone. But what started as a simple ritual to stay connected to an absent leader has, over time, been layered with supernatural claims, exclusivity rules, and theological debates that seem to miss the point entirely. Instead of helping people feel like they belong, the ritual often becomes a gatekeeping tool. The idea that a piece of bread physically becomes the body of a first-century rabbi is not something that can be proven or necessarily disproven. It's a belief. But unfortunately, some churches use that belief to decide who's worthy of participating. It's turned something that could be a beautiful and symbolic thing to do, it's turned it into something exclusive, something transactional. And when we use sacred rituals as a way to separate people instead of to connect them, we're not honoring the spirit of the moment. We're distorting it. Imagine instead if the focus was on shared memory, shared values, shared hope. Whether it's bread and wine or just sitting down at a table together, rituals like this can give people a sense of connection across time, across space, and across differences. We don't need to believe in magic to believe in meaning. And we certainly don't need to use ritual to judge others or assert our control over them. If anything, we need to reclaim the parts of these traditions that help people feel seen and known and accepted. So the main lesson I got from our second reading is that shared rituals should help bring people together. What started as a simple act of remembrance has become, in many circles, a divisive ceremony wrapped in layers of theology. But we can still choose to reclaim its meaning. At their best, rituals aren't about proving who's right or who's worthy. They're about reminding us that we're in this together. These rituals should unite us, not divide us. And that's why shared rituals should help bring people together. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of Luke. And there's a lot to love about this story. People are hungry, resources are limited, and somehow everyone ends up fed with plenty to spare. It's the kind of story that makes you want to believe in possibility, in abundance, and kindness. And while the story is clearly mythological in its telling, 12 baskets left over after feeding thousands with 5 loaves and 2 fish, well, it reflects something beautiful about human aspiration. The idea that when we stop hoarding and start sharing, we might actually have more than enough. But the church doesn't stop at the surface level message of compassion and generosity. It uses this story as theological scaffolding for the sacrament of the Eucharist, a ritual that has become a tool for control. In Catholicism, the feeding of the 5,000 isn't just about feeding people. It's about who gets to say the blessings, who gets to receive them, and who's considered worthy to participate. The joyful miracle of shared food becomes a justification for institutional gatekeeping. And that's where the danger is. When a myth about radical inclusion is turned into a doctrine of exclusion, something has gone seriously wrong. It's frustrating, honestly. A story that should inspire us to take care of each other, to be generous and inclusive, ends up being twisted into a system for determining who's in and who's out. The myth of the loaves and the fishes could remind us that small acts of sharing create ripple effects we can't always see, but that they're there It could challenge us to ask, who around me is hungry? Maybe not just for food, but hungry for dignity or for love. And how can I help? But instead, it's often used to reinforce who holds power and who doesn't. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that even positive stories can be twisted to support negative ideas. There's real beauty in this myth if we're willing to let it breathe, if we resist the urge to turn it into dogma. Stories like these are meant to spark action and compassion. They're not meant to justify a rigid hierarchy or exclusion. So let's be careful. Even good stories can become harmful when they're used to prop up bad systems. We have to stay awake to how stories are being used, and we have to be bold enough to reclaim those stories when it's necessary. Because even positive stories can be twisted to support negative ideas. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Genesis, the main lesson I came away with was gifts aren't given to put someone in your debt. In our second reading from 1 Corinthians, the main lesson I got was shared rituals should help bring people together. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was even positive stories can be twisted to support negative ideas. You don't have to believe in magic bread or ancient priesthoods to find real meaning in these stories and even in the rituals. A values-based Christian doesn't chase theological perfection. They look for human wisdom. They ask, does this tradition help us love each other better? Does this story push us toward compassion or towards control? Because when rituals become rigid and stories are weaponized, we lose the point entirely. But when we strip away the guilt trips, the gatekeeping, and the spiritual IOUs, what we're left with is something powerful. Shared memory, shared purpose, shared humanity. That's not abandoning the tradition. That's honoring it in the most meaningful way possible. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall and see if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what and now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care about this because not everyone who grew up Christian wants to throw the whole thing out. And they don't have to. Traditions, stories, even rituals can still have power and beauty if we're willing to dust them off and look at them through the lens of our values. You can be a values-based Christian without buying into the magic bread or miracle math. Because it's not about theology. It's about meaning. This is important because way too many clergy still act like spiritual bouncers deciding who's worthy to get into the club. That's not leadership. That's gatekeeping. And if there's a God who is really as loving and wise as they claim, why would you need a middleman at all? Real spiritual leadership lifts people up. It doesn't lock them out. We should care about this because doubting isn't weakness. It's wisdom. Questioning wild-ass supernatural claims and tangled theological arguments isn't a betrayal of anyone's faith. It's how we grow. As Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians, test everything, retain what is good. That's not heresy. That's maturity. This is important because this matters to our communities. Whether you're still in a church or not, we all live side by side. If Christian identity continues to be used as a tool for control and exclusion, that affects everyone. But if more people, especially those who are still active members in church communities, would stand up and say, let's reclaim what's good, we just might get back to something beautiful. We just might be able to rediscover shared love, shared values, and shared humanity. Those are the things that were allegedly most important to the very first followers of the way. Let's care enough to make space for that. And the last question I try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Where do we go from here? So this week, the readings were chosen for the Feast of Corpus Christi, the celebration of the most holy body and blood of Christ. It's a big deal in Catholic tradition. At least, it's supposed to be. Official church teaching says that the bread and wine become the actual body and blood of Jesus during the Eucharist. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, literally. But if you ask your average Catholic, you'll probably get a shoulder shrug or a polite, well, maybe, kinda. And that's actually important to name, because so many people sit through rituals they don't fully understand or no longer fully believe in just to stay connected to their community. Or they do it out of some vague sense of obligation. And that raises a bigger question we all need to ask. So with that in mind, here's your question for the week. What religious tradition, story, or ritual do I want to reclaim or reinterpret in a way that's more meaningful to me today? This question matters because Corpus Christi is a great example of how easy it is to get caught up in the outer form of something while completely missing the meaning behind it. I used to be a devout Catholic, and for a long time I believed that what the church taught about marriage, that it's between one man and one woman, and the primary purpose is to have kids. That message was repeated so often, especially when it came to same-sex couples. Right? They can't have kids. That was the go-to argument. But then I started thinking more critically about it. The church allows elderly couples to get married, even though they can't have children. People who are sterile, they're still allowed to marry in the church. So what's the real difference? That's when it hit me. Those arguments weren't about logic or consistency. They were about control. Now, I also started looking into the church's claim that Jesus instituted the sacrament of marriage. Supposedly, that's based on the wedding at Cana. But historically, the church didn't even consider marriage a sacrament until the 13th century. Before that, it was just a secular contract. Now, the more I learned, the more I realized the church had drifted away from the actual point of marriage. It's supposed to be a celebration of love between two people, a commitment they're making freely and joyfully. So why do clergy think they have the authority to decide who gets to make that commitment or who gets to celebrate that love in a community ritual? Eventually, I stopped seeing the church's stance as sacred or protective. I started seeing it for what it was: arrogance, propped up by centuries of rigid dogma. And I knew they were wrong. Any two people, regardless of sex, gender, race, or background, should be supported by their community when they choose to marry. That bond is no less holy. If anything, it's more sacred when it comes from a place of deep love, shared values, and mutual commitment. I no longer buy into the church's theology around marriage, but I still believe in the value of marriage. And I believe we can reclaim the rituals and traditions in a way that honors everyone's love. Whether you've left church entirely or still show up now and then, Reflecting on the beliefs and rituals you've outgrown can help you figure out what still matters. Maybe it's belonging or compassion or finding ways to connect with something bigger than yourself. So spend some time thinking about what religious tradition, story, or ritual you want to reclaim or reinterpret in a way that's more meaningful for you today. Do that, and you can start building new practices that are more honest, more grounded, and far more meaningful. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. The Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, verse 35, says, "It is better to perform one's own prescribed duty, even if imperfectly, than to perform another's duty, even if perfectly." Another way of saying that is, it is better to live your own destiny imperfectly than to live an imitation of somebody else's life with perfection. There's something incredibly freeing in that line, don't you think? The idea that authenticity matters more than perfect conformity. The idea that trying to live out your own truth, imperfectly, yes, messy even, is still more meaningful than copying someone else's path just because it's more accepted or comes with institutional approval. It's a strong reminder that wisdom isn't about getting all the theology right. Wisdom isn't about memorizing the rules. Wisdom is about aligning your life with your values. The church might say a ritual only counts if you do it their way, believing exactly what they say and following their rules. But the Bhagavad Gita invites us to step back and ask, is this really mine? Or am I just imitating someone else's life? This quote connects very well to our question. What religious tradition, story, or ritual do I want to reclaim or reinterpret in a way that's more meaningful to me today? The goal isn't to be perfect. The goal isn't to perfect someone else's version of faith or belief. It's to live our own values with honesty and integrity. That might mean letting go of rituals that don't resonate anymore. Or it might mean keeping them, but giving them a new life-giving purpose. Either way, your spiritual path, whether deeply religious, quietly curious, or fully secular, should feel like your own, not someone else's. Because reclaiming meaning is always more powerful than just imitating doctrine. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week. But in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week and pay attention to the important lessons you come across, wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for the Feast of Corpus Christi, Cycle C of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that looking for the shared memory, shared purpose, and shared humanity isn't abandoning the tradition. That's honoring it in the most meaningful way possible. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, and 2011 by Biblica Inc., used by permission, all rights reserved worldwide. Thank you for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find both the podcast and the occasional video versions of the presentations at thecodaproject.com. CODA stands for Creating Our Divine Alignment. When we learn to align our words and actions with our core values, that alignment feels absolutely exquisite. It feels divine. But it's a divine alignment that doesn't require belief in the supernatural. It's a divine alignment we have the ability to create for ourselves. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the CODA Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.